Depatriarching Masculinity and Reclaiming Its Heart is the title of this presentation. Life against death is the theme I'm humbly seeking to face in this series of 6 presentations. Eros against Thanatos. And as you can see in this picture, that is how we speak of these powerful, contrasting, instinctual forces in depth psychology. We as human beings must constantly face the choices of how we will accept or deny the decisions these fundamental life forces confront us with every day. My first presentation will be on choosing life by depatriarching what we currently think of as masculinity and restoring its true spirit as a supportive force for strength, creativity, and love in our world. So I want to thank you for joining me and allowing me to share some of my thoughts with you. Sometimes I feel like I am stuck in the middle of the second stanza of T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, where it speaks to me of how I'm experiencing masculinity in our society today. The poet wrote, "What are the roots that clutch, what branches grow? Out of the stony rubbish, Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats." Great societies have always lived with outstanding masculine ideals and images. Intelligence and integrity were valued personally. Good leadership included compassionate authority, goodwill, and the use of power in service to the community. In their personal and collective roles, fathers sought to create a culture that protected women and children and fostered true education, art, and culture. These great masculine images now lie in broken pieces on the stony rubbish heaps of our time in history. In these presentations, I want to return to the deeper origin of archetypal patterns. That is, the fundamental patterns for potentials to be lived, both positive and negative, that are inherited structures common to everyone's personality. The archetype represents a pattern that channels our instinctual flow of energy. When this pattern is aroused, it releases a charge of emotional energy. In other words, when circumstances or someone pushes the button of our masculinity, for better or worse, it causes us to have an emotional response. For example, when the negative aspect of the masculine archetype is aroused within us, the inferior side of our masculinity takes over. Then we feel weak, scared, distrustful of life and others, and seek to compensate these feelings with a drive for power. I want to remember the positive aspects of the masculine archetype, the positive potentials that have been scattered, suppressed, and lost. I want to invite you to join me in revitalizing the life force behind them. Then, through the awareness that is at the core of our personal development, reclaim our capacities for strength, love, and wholeness. In these kinds of journeys, we quickly learn that knowing ourselves on these deep levels becomes the foundation for being able to know others. Self-knowledge activates and substantiates our knowledge of the world and opens us to the family of humanity. Now, you might imagine from my title that I'm going to jump right into talking about the state of masculinity in our lives today. But the few words I have borrowed from the wasteland remind me, and I think most of you might agree, that we are living in a time of relentless, traumatic stress that includes alienation, polarization, violence, and an undertow of anxiety. And many of us blame a lot of what has happened to us on the so-called patriarchy or toxic masculinity. But only a few of us are taking responsibility for healing and transforming the sickly state of masculinity in our culture. I hope my words will be an invitation to you to move strongly in the direction of healing this cornerstone in the soul structure of human life. Now, I will begin by developing a framework for understanding how we must strike out anew to appreciate and bring into life the masculine's principle of not only creating life, but also using strength, courage, and integrity in the service of life and each other. In other words, what we once called character, and was an ideal to be developed in young men. One of the main things that attracted me to Jungian psychology was its perspective that every one of us has a better self within us. Now just think about how important that realization can be. Every one of us has within us the potential for a better self, evolving throughout our entire lifetime. That idea alone is a great source of hope for me. Dr. Jung's individuation process is a continuous quest that is meant to compel our growth toward our better selves. All too often, we only accept this quest out of the distress of our suffering and lowest moments. Based on his many years as a doctor of the human soul, Dr. Jung described the life force within us as Eros. And I will explain this force more as we go on. I learned through my own years of experience that Dr. Jung's individuation process is not a simple heal our wounds or fix the problems in our lives approach to our difficulties. Of course, it includes the healing of our minds and spirits from many different kinds of wounds and challenges to our hearts. But individuation is much more than that. It is an approach based on seeing our wounds, difficult experiences, and challenges as a call to grow into a bigger version of ourselves, to seek wholeness, our better selves, and to live a life of meaning and fulfillment while living through life's experiences of both tragedy and success. In our search for a healthy life, we have learned that we must nourish, challenge, and exercise our bodies and give them their needed rest. In our quest for our better selves, we have to nourish, challenge, and exercise our minds and hearts and give them their needed rest. In thinking about the commitment this requires, a particularly troubling complaint I often hear comes to mind. People frequently seem to complain that Dr. Jung and Jungians are hard to read and understand. But our psyches, as well as our bodies, are interested and complicated in a wonderful way. Yet we wouldn't think we should be able to read a biology or an organic chemistry book as smoothly as we read a novel or understand them as effortlessly as we might a popular self-help book. The reality is that our psyche and our personality is as complicated as our physical body. And any field of study that pursues developing a compilation of knowledge is forced to develop a specialized language that helps us better understand the field, which in this case is ourselves. If we truly want to understand ourselves, we must challenge our minds and go beyond simply reading these books to thoughtfully studying them. We must seek to understand what they are saying about our lives, who we are, how we were formed, and how we are living. Then we must integrate that knowledge into how we're facing ourselves in life. Now, Dr. Jung considered Eros the instinctual urge to grow and even to heal that will support us in this process of challenging our minds and hearts. It's the inborn urge for life that mysteriously moves us to seek understanding, just as such an inborn urge moves the sunflower to turn its face toward the sun. But as Dr. Freud recognized, we also have an anti-growth instinctual force. He called this force within us Thanatos. Thanatos first appears as a desire to live in a non-challenging state of unconsciousness. In depth psychology, we often think of the force of Thanatos as resistance, a resistance to fully engage in the challenge of life. Thanatos dares us to confront it with the awareness of its presence, with fierceness, determination, and a love of life. We have become so accustomed to our consumer-driven culture that without realizing it, we have become passive in the face of too many of life's demands. We think we're supposed to spend money in some way to seek pleasure, peace, comfort, and happiness continually. We're so used to this consumer's perspective that we play down and even stigmatize our struggles, our illnesses, and even our death. In short, we deny the tragic sense of life. We have forgotten that in our Western heritage, the ancient Greeks ended every play season with a tragedy to remind their audience of life's reality. Unfortunately, while being so busy seeking health and happiness, we do not see or understand the depths of meaning in our suffering and death and the potential they give us for bonding with each other as human beings. As a consequence, we do not see or know our ability to treat our lives as precious, except for giving them materialistic lip service. Thanatos, this force that wants us to deny reality and growth, helps us throw our lives away and allow others close to us to do the same, like throwing fast food wrappers by the side of the highway. In contrast, Dr. Jung stands for Eros and calls us to seek our better selves and greater lives. In the face of the influence of Thanatos in our culture today, I had to ask myself, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a man? So I want to take a few minutes to tell you how life came to demand that I figure out for myself what it meant to be a man, and how its foundation is on the great archetypal masculine principle. And then I had to go beyond this foundation and include a portion of the great archetypal feminine in my journey into my better self. Dr. Jung considered both to be necessary in our own unique way. As is wonderfully shown in this painting by Gustav Klimt. This part of my journey began when Eros and Thanatos collided in my life. I had just entered my mid-30s. Up to that point, I had followed the cultural narrative of my time in adult life, into adult life. I had graduated from college, married, had 3 children, a nice home, but I was fulfilling a cultural narrative from the 1950s. During the 1960s, that narrative began to fracture, as did my life, which was also threatened by my wife's chronic illness. Increasing years of therapy moved me to seek a new narrative and become active in inner city work. Meanwhile, I continued seeking self-knowledge through therapy and analysis, returned to school, and became a psychologist. But by the end of the decade, the challenges of my wife's illness, being responsible for a family, and reinventing my life overwhelmed me. I fled to the Jung Institute in Zurich for help. To help me understand my life, I had to learn that Eros and Thanatos are the 2 forces that, in a broader sense, can alternate with each other in a dynamic and creative way that goes above and beyond what we usually think of as good and bad. Sometimes Thanatos limits us or stops us cold when we need to stop, forcing us to learn how to begin again. Death and rebirth are metaphors for the archetypal process of transformation that charts the course both we and nature grow and live by. These 2 instinctual forces represent the cycles of growth that each one of us must experience and that each level of civilization must go through. It is as natural as the seasons going through summer, fall, winter, and spring. In this process, Thanatos represents the arrival of the death part of the cycle. This is the time we must face and are often overwhelmed by the initial reality that the perspectives we've had about ourselves and life that gave us our identity and security must be confronted. Or as it was in my case, understand that they had failed. Every time this confrontation occurs, we are tempted to cling to the perspectives and values that we knew or the illusions of what we thought life should be. But Eros challenges us to surrender what we once felt confident in and without bitterness or self-pity, go through the dark night of the soul of transformation and a fundamental change of heart. In my case, as I wrote in my book, Cracking Open, it brought a cracking open of my heart, an expansion of my capacity to love. As our individuation progresses, Eros and Thanatos are no longer battling opposites. They become opposites whose dynamic conflict makes life more challenging, precious, and worthy of love and devotion. They are, in fact, nested in a greater creative potential for unity within us that can help us become more whole and alive if we are brave enough to recognize it. Well, arriving in Zurich, I collapsed in bed for the first 2 months. I ate, I slept, I walked by the lake of Zurich, where Dr. Jung had walked. I attended a few lectures at the Institute and made a few new friends. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. Gradually, as my energy returned, I became more deeply involved in a personal transformation initiated by years of struggle and finally desperation about who I was and my vision of my future. I had to pause and turn the page to a new chapter in my life. I was in the process of dying to the old notions that had defined me, told me who I was and should be, and what my responsibilities were, and what should make me happy. During that time, I was relying on my personal analysis, that is, my inner work, to transform and heal my heart. I was also relying on my analysis and studies to heal and open my mind. I was relying on my commitment to the pursuit of self-knowledge to carry me through the profound emotions of confronting my past and doing the work to accept it, to learn from it, to grow from it, and not to fear drowning in its traumatic periods or what I had seen as failures. This journey opened me to a future I could have never planned or imagined. And that was no luxurious time out in life. I had little money to start with, and Massimila, who I met about halfway through the program and married, and I worked illegally and took on huge educational loans. During my studies at the Institute, I soon discovered that opening and expanding my mind needed to go hand in hand with opening and expanding my heart. Doing this meant I had to quit kidding myself, accept my sensitivity and complexity, and learn from those like Dr. Jung who had made the journey before me. That current narrative defining what it means to be a man had failed in my life and during my lifetime in general. Simply put, I had to begin to construct my own narrative of what it means to be a man. I began to write, and this writing became my thesis as it shaped who I was becoming. My thesis at the Jung Institute, later published as a book, The Resurrection of the Unicorn, reflected the work of my heart and mind to define the profound dimensions of manhood and myself. My thesis told the truth about how our culture has impoverished, and the word I use in my thesis is emasculated, the finest, most loving, and life-giving qualities of the masculine spirit, and open the door for the shadow side's darkest qualities of masculinity to step onto our national stage and into our collective value structure. In my studies at the Jung Institute, we explored the complexities of human development, including primitive initiation rituals, which illustrated the archetypal structure that guided young men and women into adulthood. Our ancient ancestors realized adulthood doesn't come naturally. It has to be earned. As I was completing my studies in the late 1980s, we began to hear a lot about the lack of masculine initiation rituals in our society. Unfortunately, and in spite of their good intentions, too many writers and workshop leaders, in their haste to capitalize on a trend, became the victims of the myth that drives our society, the myth of consumerism. They sought to gain popularity and financial rewards from books and workshops that interpreted initiation as a shallow experience in male bonding or going off in the woods and having a cathartic experience. These experiences, while often emotionally moving, were in sharp contrast to the actual indigenous initiations that were structured by profound archetypal systems, and which is very important. These older rituals had complete social approval and affirmation by the tribe. Our more recent activities rarely resulted in self-responsible maturity. Self-responsible maturity gives one the foundation for facing the blood, sweat, and tears, the challenges of life with courage, love, compassion, and social responsibility. Truthfully, the ancient rites revealed an archetypal structure for becoming a man that was much more profound than was realized in these more modern efforts. To begin with, the first steps in their initiation rituals was one of education. Before the initiations took place, the men, primarily the fathers in the tribe, taught the young men the skills they needed as adults to hunt, to fight, to take necessary journeys, to care for their families, and other skills that they may need. The second step was to set up circumstances, usually in the dark of night, to terrify them before they faced a physically challenging ordeal, which was the third step in the initiation process. These two steps were both a test of and a lesson in the courage and endurance needed to live as an adult. They emphasize the reality that adult life is often scary, challenging, and difficult. There were no illusions about living happily and securely. These three steps were, as the well-known mythologist Joseph Campbell stated, to prove the young man had the right stuff to be a self-responsible and contributing member of society. In the fourth step, the medicine man or shaman in the tribe would teach them how to deal with suffering, illness, and death, which was fairly common in their lives. In the fifth step, the wise elders taught them the spirituality of their heritage and the meaning of sexuality and family responsibilities for their tribe. In the sixth step, these same wise elders taught them their obligations to things that were good, that were for the good of their tribe or society. The seventh step in the initiation was a celebration by the entire tribe that affirmed them as adults and welcomed them into their adult roles in the tribe. Now, during these studies, I soon realized that in today's world, we do not have steps or rituals. The markings for young men's development are totally absent. The second thing I realized later in my professional practice was that without understanding what it truly means to be an adult, we can live our entire lives and even be conventionally successful while actually remaining half children. Or we can live lives that have an undercurrent of unhappiness and even desperation at times without ever understanding why that is. While we have considered the ancient tribes undeveloped, the underlying human dimensions of what they did was archetypally guided and therefore profound in a way they were not aware of. We need to learn from the underlying archetypal structure of these rituals, not so that we can copy them, but so that we as individuals can figure out how to do them for ourselves. The simple truth in today's world is that we must learn how to initiate ourselves. The archetypal steps in the old rituals give us a skeleton for this process. We have to learn how to create the new substance to flesh them out ourselves. We cannot depend on the self-serving narrative that our culture now offers us. Step by step, the young men in the initiation process made a choice to go forward. Each choice fortified their personality for encountering life and its unforeseen challenges, and formed a foundation for developing their up to now unknown potential. Well, back in my analytic training in Zurich, I went to sleep after finishing my ethnology paper on initiation. I felt pretty good and was looking forward to my exam on the paper. Around 2:30 in the morning, a woman's voice woke me up and said, "There's a big difference between theory and experience." I sat up in my bed and began to think about this. In the dark hours before dawn, I realized I had never been initiated. I hadn't been very well prepared to face the larger realities in life, nor had I grown up in an atmosphere where I learned how to evaluate my life as significant, worthwhile, and a part of something bigger. Neither my family, religion, education, or social life gave me a foundation for believing my life made sense and should be energized by a sense of purpose beyond making a living and enjoying life. The fathers in my childhood taught me very little about the skills of being a self-responsible adult. They didn't teach me how to face the world of work and relationships, especially the emotional skills, or the places for tenderness and creativity. Nor did they teach me about the inherent terror in living and the courage and resilience I needed to face the realities of life. The absence of learning a supportive spiritual context for living, loving, sexuality, and what family responsibilities are in terms of the heart and true character led me to make many unintentional mistakes and have an underlying level of anxiety over the years. And perhaps the worst part of all of this is the failure of our society to understand manhood and to celebrate it. This failure caused the most positive values of the masculine principle to fall into our collective shadow and put our society on a destructive course. This discussion alone reminds me of one of Dr. Jung's most well-known statements, which is, "Where love stops, power begins, and violence and terror." Where love stops, power begins, and violence and terror. Then, wide awake in those early hours, I decided to try an experiment that was the opposite of my usual approach to problem solving. I wanted to build and deepen my experience of my life by listing questions. I wasn't seeking answers. I was trying to ask questions, as the great poet Rainer Maria Rilke suggested in his book, Letters to a Young Poet. In this case, my approach is more that of query, exploring until something is revealed by being lived into, which often brought more questions. For example, I decided to look into all of the questions each step in the initiation brought up for me. I began to list the questions about manhood that had preoccupied me from the start and that kept returning to my mind. There were such questions regarding the nature of what it means to be a man, questions regarding the nature of strength, endurance, feelings, fatherhood, religion, spirituality, achievement, love, and responsibility to others and to community. I soon became aware of how little instruction I had received directly in these areas. I went through what I called a quest of questioning for each of the 7 stages of initiation. As I was considering the first stage, I asked myself deep down, what terrified me the most about becoming an adult man? I wanted the questions to take me deeper into the core of meaning in every stage, to take me to an understanding or insight I would not have reached without this exploration. And I did not settle for answers that were intellectual. They had to be ones my heart felt were true. For example, there was a lot that terrified me about growing up. To begin with, I didn't have a clue as how to do it, or what kind of life would actually be fulfilling for me when I was entering adulthood at age 21. My father had told me throughout my earlier years that at age 21, or when I got married, I would be a man and on my own. As a result of that, I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff with no way back. But later in my quest of questions, I discovered as I worked through this process, the other steps reveal answers to the first one, my fear. I spent about an hour a day on this quest for almost 6 months. The more I pursued the questions, the more they sustained me and the better I felt about myself and my ability to face life. It sounds like a lot of work, but I had already learned that investing in my individuation process pays off in dividends beyond what I could have planned or imagined. The questions we all ask should depend upon who we are and our history. But I would suggest ones like this. As you question each step in the initiation process, what questions linger in your mind as you reflect on this step? What questions come to mind as you consider this step? What questions flow from there? How could having this step in your growing up have affected your life? How can it inform your life now? What intuitions does it bring up in you? Is any part of it or the lack of it driving your life? Does any part of it fascinate or obsess you? How is your understanding of your manhood evolving? Does this stage speak to any of the major issues in your life today? What other questions about this stage would you like to ask yourself? Take the time to invite yourself to write down the thoughts and feelings that emerge from this quest. Thoughts and feelings about yourself, the questions, the stages, and your efforts to respond to them. As I was sharing my quest for questions about initiation in manhood, my analyst helped me realize I was confronting my shadow. My studies had taught me confronting our shadows is the first step in developing self-knowledge in Dr. Jung's individuation process. Of course, I had read a lot, and I thought I had some knowledge of what confronting your shadow means, but I had a lot more to learn about the complexity of this undertaking. I thought my shadow was made up of negative aspects of myself I had repressed in order to get along in my life. Well, I had no idea the images of our shadow could be paradoxical and contain hidden positive potentials, hidden gold as this image illustrates. For example, I had a series of dreams with vicious-looking gangster figures active in them. Naively, I concluded, wow, this is a bad part of me I don't want to deal with or even have. As I explored these figures with my analyst and dialogued with them in active imagination, I began to realize they were picturing my repressed ability to be strong and, if necessary, aggressive in interpersonal relationships, even when it was clearly in my own best interest. When we repress strong instinctual energies within ourselves that should be consciously valued, then they turn negative in our unconscious. Then they can appear as unsavory or threatening figures in our dreams. During this exploration, I discovered my repressed aggressive instinct was being expressed in my outer world relationships passive aggressively, which made them easier to deny. In my inner world, these instincts also attacked me with self-criticism and self-doubt. This simple example helped me understand the importance of confronting my shadow, seeking to understand if and where I consciously need to be able to control or integrate it into the increasing wholeness of my personality. During this discussion of my questions and my understanding of my manhood with my analyst, I realized a lot of what could have been the foundation of mature masculinity in my development was still unformed potentials in my shadow, even though I was 47 years old. Over the years, I learned a good bit about life's realities the hard way. But the process left me feeling alone and isolated from part of what I thought of as the successful society around me. All too often, it seems to me like accepting the reality that life is scary, challenging, and difficult in our positive thinking, consumer-driven culture is not just countercultural, it is downright shaming. Learning how to accept, understand, and meaningfully deal with suffering, illness, traumas, and death as a part of life and being human was practically unknown during my formative years, even though we experienced plenty of it. This lack of learning how to live into and deal with life saddled me with decades of a low level of depression that I was unaware of at the time. In pursuing my quest for questions with my analyst, and through my studies and writing, I continue to find myself becoming stronger and yet more tender and openly expressive. I faced the fear I had lived with, as well as the underlying depression I had been unaware of for decades. During this period, I finally faced the despair I had locked away in my heart from my early trauma and its aftermath, as well as the continuing challenges and traumas in my adult life. With this new understanding, I recorded all of these thoughts and feelings in my journal. This wealth of material contributed to my thesis at the Jung Institute that became my book on healing and reclaiming the values of masculinity. During this transformative process in my late 40s, my personality developed extensively, which meant it grew to see, accept, and interpret reality in a much more profound and complex way than I had been capable of before. Also, I became increasingly aware of how much reality I had failed to see and how many of the illusions I had lived without recognizing they were illusions. This confrontation with my shadow to reclaim the best of masculine values dramatically increased my sense of agency. That is the belief I have some control in my life or in my response to life. That is, to understand, to integrate, and to make sense of my own experience while thinking about myself and life in complex ways. I remember that my analyst laughed quietly at my conclusions. He agreed with them and said we need to be initiated. In other words, securely grounded in the better aspects of our masculinity. This foundation of strength, confidence, and basic humanity for our personality is not only necessary to be a self-responsible adult, but also in order to truly meet, appreciate, and accept the feminine principle within ourselves. If we aren't grounded in mature masculinity, he said, our emotional lives, our ability to meet a transformative future, and our relationships with real women will be governed for better or worse, and usually for worse, by our mother complexes. The issue of dependency, trust, and confidence in ourselves and life we haven't confronted and resolved in our first and primal relationship with the feminine. These issues are well developed and explained in the second half of my book, Becoming Whole. At this point, I want to go on in our recognition of the importance of the great feminine principle, the anima, inherent in the personality of every man. Many years ago, before I went to Zurich, when I was reading Dr. Jung's writings about the anima and the animus, the feminine component in a man's personality and the masculine component in a woman's personality, I felt like I was understanding the ideas and they seemed to make sense. As far as I could tell, Dr. Jung's thinking began with the reality that a man's physical makeup also contains a certain amount of female hormones, and a woman's physical makeup contains a certain amount of male hormones. As he worked with more and more men and women, Dr. Jung observed that within every man's personality, there's an archetypal feminine component he called the anima. Likewise, in every woman's personality, there's an archetypal masculine component he labeled the animus. Then Dr. Jung went a step further and said that when a man is interacting with a woman, in many cases, he will project onto her his unconscious perception of his own female component or anima. Likewise, a woman frequently projects her animus onto a man. These kind of projections cloud the lens of how we see the other person as another person in their own right. Even in these early years, I could begin to get the idea that if we didn't know ourselves and the forces that molded us well, these dynamics can lead to messy interactions. Furthermore, the way we respect and value the opposite sex may actually reflect the way in which we value that inner part of ourselves. The inner parts of ourselves carry the memories and experiences that originated in our interactions with our fathers and mothers. While at the time I didn't realize what that exactly meant, but it grabbed my attention and led to the desire to know more about the inner forces and what they meant in my relationships to myself and to others. There was some general agreement about what is masculine and feminine in the world I grew up in, and I took these definitions in without knowing I should question them. These two definitions were also thought of as gender characteristics, without any thought being given to them as more complex archetypal human characteristics. For example, principles of masculinity were seen as the energy making things happen and getting things done. Men were supposed to be strong, independent, determined, materialistic, especially in business and science. The principles of femininity were seen as those of nourishment and growth. They were thought to be emotional and feeling-oriented in qualities such as cooperation, harmony in relationships, sensitivity, and beauty in art and religion. In my 80-plus years our lives have grown rapidly in complexity, while the general way we understand ourselves has not, much to our own detriment. This simplistic way of thinking has lost its connection to the more profound aspects of the archetypal realities of the masculine and feminine principles, including their shadow sides, and that they are larger than gender definitions. In our country and our Western heritage, these qualities I described tended to be identified with men and women respectively. In a general social sense, either one principle or the other was the way of thinking. Polarity tended to become concretized, and that tendency seemed to increase over the last few centuries and marched right into the predominant thinking of my formative years. But when I was beginning my studies in Zurich in 1985, I thought I understood these principles and the direction our culture was headed in. Yet I was in for a real surprise when I began to discover during my analysis and studies at the Jung Institute what the masculine and feminine really meant in my life. During my work there, I soon came to realize that it is always conflict and difficulties that cause me to wake up and thrive, to grow into a larger version of myself. I also became aware it is often my anima driving this process. I explained this when I wrote in my book, Cracking Open, that my analyst said, the feminine archetype, represented by the feminine principles of life, aspects of the Great Mother image, and so on, gives and supports life. She has two characteristic forms. The first one is referred to as elementary and corresponds to the maternal holding, childbearing, nurturing, and protective features that we generally attribute to the symbolic nature of the Great Mother. But there is another side to the feminine nature, an opposite one that is transformative in its character. This form of the feminine corresponds to the images of Sophia, the wisdom of the divine, and the eternal cycle of life. Goethe summed up this aspect of the mothers by describing it in Faust as formation, transformation, eternal preservation of eternal meaning. After that explanation, I shared a dream with my analyst, also in my book, Cracking Open, where I encountered an intense, transforming feminine figure. He went on to explain, you should be studying her now in your training seminars and know that she, your anima, is the image of part of your psychological makeup. She is the feminine part of your nature, all that you can see and experience in a woman. Your experience of your mother is the first imprint on your anima. But she isn't any woman you have loved or hated. Still, you probably see part of her in each of them Because if you love a woman, you project part of this image onto her, at least initially. The same is true if you hate a woman, because our anima also has a very disagreeable side. She inspires great art and poetry, compassion through love and endurance, wars of passion and jealousy, as well as some of our greatest love stories. She develops through several psychological and imaginal stages that are archetypal and have both positive and negative potentials. In their positive potentials, they're imaged as mother, lover, inspiratrix, creatrix, and wisdom. In your dreams, we see you fleeing from an old and threatening inner conflict that takes place on an island in isolation. You reach the sanctity of your cabin, and when inside or withdrawn from yourself, you feel safe. And then your anima appears in a challenging form. I was surprised at being challenged to learn transformation and new beginnings need to be an ongoing aspect of my life. Yes, I was surprised as I realized my journey into being, into my full human potential, must be a profound quest for self-knowledge and a journey into my full experience of life. Only then could my life become renewed, unique, and personal. Within myself, I had to learn how to develop my masculine strength, will, and creativity. From this development, I then had to join hands with the nurturing, challenging, and transforming qualities of my anima. I have to do this for the sake of advancing my own wholeness and in order not to live in unconsciously destructive ways. So I reached this point in my personal journey to revitalize, revive, and reclaim the positive characteristics of the archetypal masculine to support my manhood. In fact, I was discovering the meaning of manhood during this quest. My journey began by realizing as our history has unfolded, it has left the positive aspects of masculinity, one of the fundamental cornerstones in our personalities and lives, lying, as T.S. Eliot noted, in a heap of broken images. From this stony rubble, we are being challenged to revitalize, revive, and reclaim the heart of the energetic forces in our personal and collective lives. Our future and certainly our satisfaction with our lives and loves depend on us facing toxic masculinity and transforming it into a force supporting life and humanity. Toxic masculinity, as I hope you can imagine at this point, is an inferior masculinity that takes over when our masculinity remains undeveloped or poorly developed. It is aroused out of a state of feeling deeply afraid, vulnerable, insecure, and alienated. These feelings are often repressed and driving one's behavior from the unconscious. Toxic masculinity compensates these states with a drive for dominance and security through the pursuit of power and the uses of anger, aggression, and emotional and even physical violence. These characteristics exist and grow and even become admired under the cover of our current socially approved values of ambition, competition, and achievement. The forces of Eros and Thanatos are two great underlying forces beneath and affecting all of our experiences. Eros is the imperative of life to grow. As men in today's world, We must learn to align ourselves with life, love, courage, and face the struggles that growth entails. If instead we fail to grow, Thanatos steps in and we will stagnate and begin to deteriorate, no matter how good we are at presenting the public face we may have been hiding behind. Thanatos tempts us with social acceptance, approval from others, emotional safety, and illusions of love and respect. Eros may cause us to question the structure of values we've been living by, the relationships and jobs we are in, and the distraction of leisure activities and entertainment in our lives. Growth is not risk-free or guaranteed to be painless. As my story revealed, we may have to make some major changes that are painful and hurt or disappoint people who are dear to us. But I learned from painful experience, if we're in jobs or relationships we cannot successfully bring love to, they will depress our spirits, erode our self-esteem, and eventually cause us to dislike ourselves. I learned that I must be man enough to choose life and face whatever risks and losses to break free of any forces that Thanatos may use to imprison my soul. The next topic I presented, primitive masculine initiation practices, came, as I mentioned, from my studies in ethnology at the Jung Institute in Zurich. As I have reflected back on these rituals over the years, I am still surprised how much archetypal wisdom was supporting them. Sociologists today tell us there are 3 conditions that make up the foundations of a meaningful life. We must see our lives as significant, worthwhile, part of something bigger, believe our lives make sense, and are engaged by a sense of purpose. While I don't in any way idealize ancient times, a careful study of their original rituals show these conditions were met. A careful study of my adolescent years show at best these conditions were not met in a way that gave me a foundation for meeting the challenges of life with meaning and purpose. The lesson is that while in older tribal societies, men performed these rituals unconsciously and instinctively in their more simple environments, in our more complex environments and diverse communities, we must learn how to develop this growth into mature manhood consciously and intentionally ourselves. As I was bringing this discussion to a close, I said that we, men, have to be grounded in the better aspects of our masculinity in order to recognize, honor, and to make a part of our lives our anima, the feminine principle within us. Our inability to recognize this aspect of ourselves can lead us into bouts of lethargy and deprive us of most of our enthusiasm, leaving us with feelings of agitations and emptiness we don't understand. This failure can cause us to respond to our emotional neediness with a depressive withdrawal or a drive for dominance, for security through achievement, which by midlife will make emotional, psychological, and spiritual maturity harder to come by. On the other hand, our capacity to actively bring our anima into our lives helps us discover that the strength, creativity, and tenderness of our masculine selves can join with the compassionate, nurturing, and transforming feminine within us in order to support eros and wholeness. In ending, I want us to remember knowledge, especially self-knowledge, is a supportive power in life. But this knowledge needs the courage and the love of life to put it into action. Only then can it create change in attitudes, in perspectives, in self-confidence, and then guide our actions. The choice is ours. Thank you very much for your kind attention. We've covered a lot of ground.